Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Faith and Family. Over the next few weeks, these episodes are going to look a little bit different. Instead of me bringing a completely different study or lesson or sermonette, however you want to describe these videos, to you on this platform, what we're going to do is we're going to actually focus our time on the reading that goes along with our daily discipleship plans for families. If you're unaware of what that resource is, it's a resource that I've made available to not just families of our church. If you want to pass it along to any family, feel free to. But there are two different plans that are all focused on the Book of Philippians. We've got a plan for families with children, kindergarten to fifth grade, and a plan for families with middle school and high school students. And again, the whole month is focused on the Book of Philippians. So with these episodes, what I'd like to do is focus our time on the reading that coincides with that particular week. This week, it's Philippians 1. So let's dive in and get to work. Welcome to Faith and Family. After a common introduction to Paul's writings, Paul begins to express his thankfulness for the Christians in Philippi. He speaks of them so highly and is so incredibly affectionate towards this particular group of believers. And the reason for that is found in the book of Acts. You see, it's Paul that helps plant this church in Philippi. So the relationships are incredibly strong, and he's incredibly grateful to see how this body of believers has grown and matured in their faith over time. I mean, he calls them partners with him in grace. He says how deeply he misses them, and he prays that their love would continue to grow. It's in verse 12 where Paul's writing shifts to what I believe is the main thrust of Philippians chapter 1, a theology of suffering. I mean, it's a pretty uncomfortable topic to broach, and it's also a pretty necessary topic to discuss, given its very real presence in our world today. But the way that Paul talks about it, I mean, it's interesting to say the least, at least on the surface. You see, Paul is writing this letter while experiencing suffering. He's imprisoned. And he's not only the one going through suffering, so is the church in Philippi. I mean, Paul's been in the middle of suffering for a little while now. So when he writes to these Christians who are also suffering, he's not writing to them like he's better than them or he's over them or he's only approaching the topic of suffering on a metaphorical, intellectual, ethereal level. I mean, he's right there with them. His suffering looks a little different, sure, but he's still suffering. And Christians in Philippi have also been persecuted pretty much since Paul left. And you would think someone who is either currently suffering or someone who is writing to a group of people who are suffering would voice their frustrations, would complain about how they're being treated, would be angry with what's happened. Not Paul. I mean, you're not going to find that anywhere in the book. It's this book that scholars deem the most joyful book in the New Testament. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think about. What Paul does is he gives us a very healthy perspective in understanding suffering in the life of the believer. And I think there's two major points for you and I to consider as we go through experiencing relatively different amounts of suffering in our own lives. So point number one is that Christians should expect suffering. We shouldn't be shocked by it. It shouldn't catch us off guard. It should not surprise us when it comes. Though suffering will look different for different people, it shouldn't blow us away. I can't believe this is happening. Paul and Jesus tell us quite clearly, it's going to come. It's going to be here. It will be a part of your life. Jesus tells his own disciples in gospel literature that if they hated me, they're going to hate you. I mean, isn't that so encouraging? It's kind of a difficult pill to swallow, but it is the truth. It's helpful to know that suffering in and of itself does not mean that you don't possess enough faith in your life. If you just have more faith, you wouldn't suffer. That's nonsense. It also doesn't mean that God is just angry with you all the time and he just feels led to just trounce you with lightning bolts of some sort. Suffering is a natural part of life. And as Christians, it's going to come. We don't need to be shocked. We don't need to be surprised. It doesn't need to catch us off guard. We need to expect that it's going to happen. The second point that I think is important for us to think about and believe is that as Christians, we should embrace suffering. So, I mean, that sounds a little odd, doesn't it? I mean, you might be sitting at home going, oh, okay, Ryan, I get the expect it. I understand that. I don't like it, but I get it. Embrace it? I mean, are you kidding me? How crazy are you? To embrace suffering? What does that look like? Why should we do it? Well, Paul tells us why. See, again, Paul is imprisoned. But while he's imprisoned, he understands something incredibly important. That though his situation, his circumstance, his surroundings are bad, God can, God will, and God is using it for good. Look at verse 12. Paul writes, "Now I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me, his imprisonment and him being in captivity, has actually resulted in the advance of the gospel." Paul says, yeah, I'm suffering. I'm imprisoned. This isn't an ideal situation. But God's using it. God's using it for good. He doesn't see the experience he's in the middle of as an obstacle to his freedom. He sees it as an opportunity to grow his faith, as an opportunity to share his faith. Many times when you and I experience suffering, in whatever capacity that might be, we tend to ask the same sort of questions. Why God? Why me? Why now? Why this? And at the center of those questions is us. Why has this happened to me? Why does this affect my life? Paul asks completely different questions. Instead of being so self-absorbed and concerned with how this is, harming him or affecting him in whatever way, his question is, how can God use this circumstance? How will God use this circumstance? How is God using this circumstance for me to point people to him? For us to see a demonstration of his glory and his goodness. This happens for Paul by understanding that, yeah, he's in prison. But what that's actually done is given him a completely new audience to hear the gospel. I mean, think about that perspective. That instead of being concerned with himself or his own interests, he is more concerned with people knowing God and learning about Jesus. I mean, this is an incredible model of how we should approach suffering too. How we should approach things that happen in life that we would consider bad or inconvenient or bothersome in some way. And to be honest, I've actually seen this play out in our own church recently. If you're not a part of Highland, each week we've put on online services that we've called Highland at Home. And what I did a couple days ago is I sat down and I crunched numbers about how many people are viewing these services and what that looked like. And what I came away with was incredible. What many of us have seen as a pretty inconvenient circumstance, quote unquote a bad thing, not being able to meet here on campus in person for Sunday school or Bible study or worship services. God is actually using in a way that most of us just don't know. Did you know that these services on all of our different platforms are reaching 3.5 times the amount of people that we would reach with an in-person service on Sunday morning? I didn't either. I mean, I kind of assumed or I had a ballpark or I thought I knew, but then when I sat down and looked at viewership numbers and all of these things on all of our different platforms, that was the solution. That was the result. 3.5 times more people are being taught God's word, are learning about Christ, and are hearing the gospel. in the midst of something bad. You could define it in some sort of way as an inconvenience, or maybe go so far as to say suffering. God's using it for good. This is Paul's idea. This is Paul's hope, that in the midst of suffering, he's going to embrace it because he knows God is at work. God is at work in Paul's life then, and he's at work in the life of our church now to advance the gospel. I want to thank you for joining me for today's episode of Faith and Family. In the link provided below, you'll see links to our daily discipleship plans, both for our K-5 plan and our students plan. And feel free to share this or send this to maybe another family that you know would utilize those resources. It's not just for Highland folks. The more the merrier, in my opinion. You'll also find the video of Dr. Gray's most recent announcement about when we plan on reopening the building. Thanks again for joining us. I love you guys. You take care, and God bless.